Well, I think we're nearly ready to start. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Peter Caputi to the meetup sessions. Peter has got an incredibly impressive number of publications to his name across a lot of different topics. Probably the group know him best for a couple of extremely useful books, one of which is this one, Personal Construct Theory, New Ideas. And you've done a couple of books on methodology, haven't you, Peter? Do you want to make yourself
That's right.
audible?
Yeah.
One of the books, unfortunately, we've got a bit of bad news about, the New Ideas book, which was edited by Peter and Linda Viney and Heather Foster. Unfortunately, we heard the news that Heather died last week. She was a wonderful, lovely, warm person that I got to know over a couple of conferences in Italy. And it's very sad to hear that news. Peter's going to be talking a bit about Would Hinkle, who was one of Kelly's students and went on to write a PhD thesis, which continues to be dipped into to this day. He originated the well-known technique of laddering. And if there's an aspect of PCP that he elaborated, it would be connected with that in terms of the hierarchy of personal construct systems. He also looked in detail at implications, and the theory that he developed underlies the important and well-known work by the Barcelona group on implicative dilemmas. Peter's going to be talking about applying some of those ideas to the COVID pandemic. So this is the second of 3 sessions we have in this series. Those of you who are able to see David, who's with us today, David Winter and Sabrina Chipoletta, will have enjoyed that session 2 weeks ago, looking at people's experiences of the pandemic. And on the 4th of February, we've got Massimo Giliberto, Francesca Del Rizzo, and Chiara Lui, who will be talking about the politicians' communication and construing of the COVID epidemic. Maybe a topic we might want to close our ears to, actually. But okay, so let's allow Peter to take the stage. Welcome, Peter Caputi.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Harry. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I apologise in advance if this material people already know about, but it's something I started to think about quite early on, actually, in January and February, and I'll come to why I started becoming interested in this back then. So, oops. I'll start by actually, some of you are probably wondering, where is Wollongong? You know, and I'm actually an Australian. You can probably, might have guessed from my accent, but Wollongong's on the east coast of Australia, and it's about 80 kilometres south of Sydney. And they're quite a lovely place. Of course, I'm biased. And I work at the University of Wollongong, and Wollongong itself is quite a picturesque and beautiful town. Here we've got a picture of our library, and obviously pre-COVID, and libraries now are very interesting places because they don't seem to have many books in there. I miss the days when there were plenty of books in there. There's full of technology and other things. But there's a little bit about Wollongong. And some of you, Harry mentioned Heather Foster and Linda Viney. Some of you also know Beverly Walker and Desley Hennessy. And it's been my great pleasure to work with those colleagues and others. And as Harry said, it was some quite sad news that we received this week about Heather. So it's quite sad. Here's a quote that I'd like to share with you. It was only 1 month ago that daily life proceeded in a routine and predictable manner, and I'll return to that. I've highlighted that in red for a reason. In the last few weeks, the world as we know it has been completely upended in what feels like a sudden crash of social and economic order. COVID-19 has shattered everything familiar about 21st century living. This was in March this year. And I think what triggered me was this idea of not able to predict things, a bit of a loss of control. And this is where I started to also look around me, and there was obviously a considerable amount of uncertainty. And you'd go to the shops and you'd observe quite unusual and inexplicable behaviours. I don't know what it was like in other countries, but toilet paper seemed to be the only thing that people wanted. It had become almost a new currency, and you could venture off in dark alleys and ask people for rolls of toilet paper because it became so important. And unfortunately, there were, some pretty ugly scenes in our local supermarkets. Some of you may have had similar experiences. I know one of the colleagues that I was talking to a fortnight ago, our Russian colleague, Andrei, said that buckwheat, for example, had become currency in around Moscow. So I wondered why was this happening? And a couple of weeks ago, Sabrina and David started to look at a constructivist interpretation, and they pointed to some of Kelly's work, and particularly trying to understand what's meant by threat and anxiety, because that's what I think I was seeing. I was seeing people who were very anxious and people feeling threatened. And from a Kellian perspective, threat refers to an awareness of an imminent and comprehensive change in one's core constructs. And in a wonderful paper by Beverly and David in 2007, in the annual review of psychology, they define their anxiety from a Kellian perspective as an awareness that occurrences are not able to be accommodated within one's current construct system. So that's a Kellian perspective, but I thought I was particularly intrigued by this notion of predictability, of anticipation. And of course, that drew me to think a little bit about, as Harry has pointed out, the work done by Hinkle and his theory of construct implications. Was there something in that theory that might, help get my head around what was going on, what was in terms of the things that I was observing? And perhaps alternative view is too strong a position. It was probably a complementary view that I was trying to understand. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the work of Dennis Hinkle, Hinkle was one of Kelly's students, and he wrote quite a remarkable thesis titled "The Change of Personal Constructs from the Viewpoint of a Theory of Construct Implications." And it's a very interesting thesis. For those of you who are doing PhDs, or those of you in academia, and I know my own PhD, I think only 3 people read that thesis, the 2 examiners and myself and my supervisors. Hinkle's thesis, a search a couple of weeks ago in Google Scholar pointed to 444 citations. This is a thesis that's only 61 pages long. It's one of the most cited PhDs, if not the cited PhD in personal construct psychology. So for those of you who think your thesis might not be read, just consider Dennis's work, where his thesis has been cited so much in the literature. So, you know, so what? What is Hinkle's contribution? Why is Hinkle's contribution so important? Faye Francella described his work as one of extraordinary originality in his theorizing. I think it would be fair to say that it is an important elaboration of Kelly's work, and at quite a fundamental level, because Hinkle invites us to reconsider, I think, what's central to personal construct theory, and that is, what is a construct? And more importantly, what is construing? And around this, he states that the explicitly stated model of man, from the viewpoint of personal construct theory, is man the scientist, one who predicts, wagers, anticipates, expects, and implies. For the purposes of further predicting, wagering, anticipating, expecting, and implying, the idea that construct definition must involve a statement of the location of a construct dimension in the context of an hierarchical network of construct implications. And so we start to, he's inviting us to think about construing, and what is construing from a Hinkleyan perspective. And this is, for me, the bit that is quite exciting in Hinkle's work, because he forces us to think about construing not only from the perspective of what is the context in which construing is occurring, but the content, the constructs themselves, and importantly, the structure, the interrelationship between constructs and, more importantly, construct poles. The idea that construing occurs not just in isolation or with one construct, but it in fact is embedded within a network of constructs. And those constructs, that network, is important, really important when it comes to understanding what we're doing. So for me, it was not just, you know, what are the constructs that people are using to make sense of their world during the pandemic, but for me, the thing, beg your pardon, for me, the idea that was important was the structure, the interconnections. And Kelly does say that these relationships are ones of implication. So within a construct system, we have constructs that are superordinate and those that are subordinate. And for me, a nice way of visualizing this, and although it's not an ideal model or metaphor for it, but you often see when you have infants in a cot, there might be a mobile located above the cot where there's toys or things hanging from the mobile, and you can shake the mobile at the top and it shakes everything down the bottom, right down the bottom. So constructs at the top of this hierarchy are very important, and shaking those or modifying those shakes the whole construct system. An important, the other thing, of course, that Hinkle does is he interprets the corollaries using this notion of implication. And again, Faye Francella pointed to how important this redefining the corollaries in terms of implications. And the choice corollary is one that is quite significant when viewed from this perspective. And for Hinkle, the choice corollary states, a person chooses for himself that alternative in a dichotomized construct through which he anticipates the greater possibility for increasing the total number of implications of his system. That is to say, a person always chooses in that direction which he anticipates will increase the total meaning and significance of his life. So stated in a defensive form, a person chooses so as to avoid the anxiety of chaos and the despair of absolute certainty. So complete certainty is also problematic as much as the idea of chaos is for Hinkle. And so this led me to think about returning to anxiety and threat. And of course, Hinkle did define these two concepts within his theory. And he referred to anxiety as the awareness of the relative absence of implications with respect to constructs with which one is confronted. Threat for Hinkle was seen as the awareness, a superordinate construction and anticipation about construct systems, of an imminent comprehensive reduction of the total number of predictive implications in personal construct system. And that to me made a lot of sense. All of a sudden, people weren't able to predict things. They weren't able to anticipate. There was a disruption of this predictive power, the predictive implications of their construct systems, and that to me was, I think, what was happening when I was looking around me. People just the if-then statements that they'd used to make sense of the world, to provide meaning in their world, just weren't there. They were disrupted. Of course, another concept that Hinkle, I think, probably as important in his theory is this idea of resistance to change. A lot of my colleagues, around February, we all of a sudden had to move all of our teaching to online, and some people struggled with that. Some people resisted that. And here, I think Hinkle also helps us understand. So for Hinkle noted that the relative resistance to change of personal constructs will be directly related to the superordinate range of implications of those constructs. And this idea is based on the principle of maximizing the total implicativeness of a system, and the notion that the anticipated degree of threat will be a direct function of the number of implications involved in change. For some people, there were very, very superordinate constructs that they had in terms of, say, their teaching. Hinkle also says that constructs functioning at a higher level of superordination in a hierarchical context will show a greater relative resistance to slot change than constructs functioning at a low level. And these superordinate constructs, for some of my colleagues, was being threatened, even when it's a thing like moving to an online system. and so on. Oops, there we go. Last fortnight, I think David and Sabrina also made us think about notions of validation, invalidation, and sad to say, it's almost 20 years ago that a group of us here at Wollongong started thinking about non-validation. And for Hinkle, he says that let's think about threat as an extensive implicative invalidation. So, for example, if being either a productive researcher or an effective therapist implies one's usefulness as a psychologist, then invalidation of one of these criteria will probably lead a person to initiate a stabilizing strategy with respect to the other in order to maintain the conception of himself as being a useful psychologist. So when invalidation of a construct threatens an implicative network with invalidation, we try to stabilize the similar constructs will function to preserve the implicative utility of the threatened network so that to which they are related. So if we're abandoning any of our anticipatory ventures, this may impact the interconnectedness of the construct networks that provides the personal meaning that we use that we use to make sense of our world. So relating to this, Kelly also talks about a situation when a person hesitates to experiment. Now remember that there's this metaphor of person as scientist. It's limited, but if we look at that metaphor of person as scientist, or at least a naive scientist, then when a person hesitates to experiment because he or she may dread the outcome, he may fear that the conclusion of the experiment will place him in an ambiguous position where he will no longer be able to predict and control. He does not want to be caught with his constructs down. He may even keep his constructs strictly to himself, lest he be trapped into testing them prematurely. And so a few of us, as I said, sadly 20 years ago, started playing around with this idea of non-validation, this non-engagement in or non-completion of the validation cycle. And I also could see in some of my colleagues during this time that this inability to put themselves in a situation where they could not predict or control. And so they were not engaging in a process of validation or invalidation, but rather deciding, I'm not even going to play the game because I don't know. It's going to be too hard. I dread the outcome. And so they were engaging in non-validation. And I found that, again, quite a useful and interesting way of making sense of what I was seeing around me. So I think that's where I'd like to stop and pass over to you for any questions. We'll have a period in our breakout groups, and there I've said these are only suggestions for people to think about, and that is a theory of construct implication useful in our understanding of our own behaviour, but the behaviours of others during the pandemic? Have people been engaging in non-validation? Have you been a non-validator during the pandemic? Or a bit like me, if you're interested in what's happening in France with the tennis, you may want to talk to people about the tennis in the chat room and wonder when and if Serena is ever going to get her 24th Grand Slam. And as much as I admire Serena Williams, the person that she's trying to emulate is an Australian, Margaret Court. So part of me is wondering whether Serena might just stick with 23 Grand Slams. So thank you so much for listening to me. These are pretty much, I'm throwing out their ideas, and I think one of the things that I'd like to encourage in this session is to explore jointly, collaboratively, whether some of these ideas that Hinkle had are useful in understanding what's going around in our worlds at the moment. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Very interesting.
We're all back, Sandy.
Right. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for coming back. Peter, thank you very much for your thought-provoking presentation. The interconnection between the nature of constructs and the processes of construing seems to be particularly pertinent at present, given our states of threat and anxiety. We probably have all experienced levels of intransivity in our personal and professional lives during COVID. I know myself, I want to put my fingers in my ears going, it's too hard to engage and just withdraw. Your questions that you put to us as a group is a theory of construct implications useful in understanding our behaviors and that of others during the pandemic? And then possibly a harder one to discuss, have I been a non-validator during COVID? I was wondering whether people would feel, would like to start things off really by considering the theory of construct implications as it stood and as Peter described it. In your own breakout rooms, what were the conclusions you came to?
In the one that I was in?
Yes, Peter, go for it. Did they dare to argue with you?
We talked about a range of things actually, but I think one of the things was to actually just think about whether we were in fact or had opportunities where or situations where we weren't engaging because we knew that things might not turn out the way they might be. I talked a little bit about my experiences of seeing my colleagues struggle with moving their lectures online, and as I said, there were some people that, and they're wonderful academics, but you know, they still think of teaching involving a blackboard and a piece of chalk, and this idea of having to use technologies and things in a different way. They were really, they didn't want to experiment at first, but the moment that they did, then they could see that that things could happen, and it was okay. There wasn't this dread of what might happen when I look stupid or whatever. So we talked about a range of things in our group. I don't know whether Judith and Sharon want to chip in there.
Either of you?
No, I mean, I think it was interesting because I think we were also talking about with the pandemic, because things kept changing. And we were saying Peter was in Australia, I'm in Northern Ireland, and then Sharon in England. So we're just talking about the rapidity of change and the messages, and that actually disengaging maybe was just it seemed to be like a useful strategy sometimes. So we were identifying with it.
And it does seem to be safety sometimes in actually stepping back and drawing breath and watching to see what happens, because if you try to keep up, sometimes it seems almost impossible. Has anybody else had any other kind of experiences which they would like to share in terms of the shifts they might have made and their experiments that they might have had to undergo, if you like, in order to keep up with the changes. I can't see everybody's screen, so you will need to say something if you want to signal to speak. Do I take it then that everybody managed to make smooth transitions to new ways of working? Right, then you've all done better than me, I have to say.
I didn't have a smooth transition to different ways of working. It took me a long, in my teaching. I mean, it was a full summer of working and trying to create an online course, and it didn't. Is that what you're asking? Is that
yes,
what you're asking? Yeah.
You know, your actual experiences of shifting. You know, trying to validate yourself by having to undergo some sort of experiment.
I'd rather give the example of my wife, who is a middle school teacher at a wealthy school district in Massachusetts, and what they did was they waited for something to happen, some miracle or something to happen, and then 2 weeks before the school starts, they come up with a plan, and they say, "Hey, do this Zoom thing, and then you're going to be hybrid," and everybody just does not know what to do, and they're scrambling like mad, and it's a horrible thing to watch, and it's demoralizing. It was demoralizing for her. Who am I as a teacher? Can I do this? Those are some of the things I've seen.
In my own work, I've been watching people getting to a point where, in a sense, there's sort of things fall apart and the center doesn't hold anymore, because even though they were working with looking at and holding desperately onto the constructs that allowed them to stay validated, every time they turned around, they would lose something else and lose something else and lose something else. And that's been one of my major concerns in the last few weeks, is watching and trying to help people to maintain a sense of validation for themselves. How are other people finding things in their work?
Well, I found, like Michael, I spend all of the summer, really, even my annual leave, on creating remote sort of pre-recording my lectures in a way that a student can easily access it instead, so personally, although it was a challenge, it's something that I wasn't too concerned about. I just get on with doing it. But it's the institutional environment. We were told, you'll do it like this, and then we said, no, do it like that, and nobody knows what to do. And even up to this week, which is the first, it's Freshers Week with us. And things are pretty chaotic because people, administration-wise, not knowing whether we, there's no clear direction. So I think it's at a level, at a kind of a collective level, there's more confusion than for individuals. So that's my experience anyway from where I teach.
And has anybody had any experience with new freshers, how they're coping with the situation?
I met my new students earlier this week, and well, in a way they don't know any better because any different, but all students, I think, even returning students, have this anxiety about how they're going to cope, what is happening, where they're going to get the teaching materials, how they're going to be assessed, and how they're expected to physically come to the university or not, and so there's a lot of uncertainties involved in it.
And how are your systems working to maintain some sense of the students' constructs about what university is supposed to be about?
You don't want me to start talking about that.
I thought you might like to speak to
Not at the moment.
Also, I suspect there are a lot of people here who just, I'm watching them nod their heads. They're here as well. They're with you. They're totally with you.
Yeah.
Has anybody got any particular questions they want to ask Peter directly?
Yeah. Hi, I'm obviously having a bad hair day or something. Anyway, I can't get the camera to work, so sorry about this, folks. I've got two questions from the talk. We have discussed it in our little breakout with Clara and Harry, but I'd be interested in Peter's comments and perhaps any wider comments. I was just kind of musing on the contrast between non-validation and constriction. That was the first thing that I was kind of chuntering on about. And the second one is this phrase slot change, which is not a phrase I've used. And so we were trying to have a think about what's the difference between slot change and change. So be interested to hear what other people think, because I think those two then feed into the other wider questions.
Mm-hmm. Peter?
Now, I might call on my colleagues here to remind me as well. But I think the idea of moving from pole to pole, exploring other poles might be something that's related to that. The idea of non-validation is, I think that there's, as I said, there's some security in not trying to explore, and I think in our group we talked about the possibility of moving from one pole to another pole that sometimes might not be a pole that we want to explore, that all of a sudden opens up possibilities for us that we haven't considered. So the idea for me of looking at me being my ideas of what teaching are, and good or innovative versus non-innovative, traditionalist in terms of exploring teaching, and I think again for me the thing, I think Michael made a really important point that I'd like to mention, that the changes are actually linked to who you are, your core constructs, and the idea of switching over to another pole that you're not familiar with. So, Peter as user of technology is really frightening in a way, because it really challenges who I am as a teacher, as an academic. What is it? And so I was trying to find out ways of trying to keep those two things going, myself as very, very simple things like in a classroom setting, walking around. I wasn't able to walk around anymore. And then I had to explore, well, how can I engage my students online in a way that I couldn't, that I was used to before? I'd move around the classroom. Well, I can't move around the classroom. I can move around my room that I'm in, but the students aren't there. So the exploration of going over to another pole and exploring that other pole, you've got to do that in a fairly safe, you need to be in a feel safe about trying to experiment. And of course, that's part of the problem, that the context is a bit different, and you don't necessarily have that safe environment in which to experiment. And I think that makes it. But I think that's to me that one of the things that non-validation is, that you don't want to start trying to muck around with the constructs that that are quite core to you in terms of who you are as an individual or as a teacher or whatever role you have.
Mm-hmm.
Peter, Cummins, you want
Sorry,
to
I'm muted. I was going to say, I've always liked the phrase slot rattling. I wondered whether you think that's the same as slot change. The idea of rattling, that you rattle from one pole to the other and maybe back again, or you may get stuck somewhere in the slot, so to speak, between the two poles, has always been very evocative to me, that I can almost see the movement along.
Oh, yeah.
Is that the same as you're using slot change, or do you think?
Yeah, that's right, Peter. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, right. It's Australian for slot rattling. Brilliant. Got it. Thank you.
You have to translate for you Aussies, you know.
Put it in the dictionary.
Yeah, you got to remember. You have to remember that English is my second language.
I was going to say, really, slot change isn't really change, is it? I mean, it's not change in terms of a revision of the construct system, looking at things in a new way.
Yeah.
So the example I used in the group with Sally and Clara was the mood change that I have around COVID, between actually feeling quite positive and optimistic, because in terms of, I mean, I'm lucky because I'm retired, but I can get on so much more easily somehow, that there's a lot of space to get on with some work, and when I'm feeling in a good mood. But then I rattle over to feeling worried and anxious about the family, and about the state of the world and the awfulness of the politics.
And then the need to kind of regulate yourself means that sometimes you really do have to back off completely and go into non-validation state in order to actually just get yourself back on an uneven keel and not be part of what's going on for a while.
Yeah, that concept of non-validation, actually, I mean, it's not a concept I've particularly used personally over the years, but it really did ring a bell today, in terms of the way you put it, in terms of not playing the game. That I quite like that way of putting it, Peter.
Sandy, there are some people with their hands raised. I don't know if you
I can't see them. Would you unmute yourself rather and just speak?
Shay3 and Roger Maitland have their hands up.
Roger, go on.
Alrighty, well, thank you. It's been a very interesting talk. One of the things that's been I've been mulling over, and we discussed in our group, was just returning to this idea of person as scientist, and as Peter, as you put it, naive scientist perhaps. But just the thoughts around, the terms prediction and control, which are emphasized in Kelly's theory, and just thinking about how perhaps our notion of what a scientist is has shifted over the years. And if we look at the shift from positivism or mechanism to a more complexity orientated view of science, is prediction and control still what we're looking for? Given the kind of entangled or wicked problems that we're facing, COVID-19 being one of them, perhaps sustainable ability and climate change being another, do we need to relook at some of these notions around that kind of root metaphor in the theory, and what it means to be a scientist? Is it still about prediction and control, or do we need to see ourselves perhaps more as futurists that are looking are facing the uncertainty and living in the uncertainty and looking at perhaps scenarios? So I just wanted to kind of raise that as something perhaps for some reflection. Sorry, it's blowing a gale here. I'm in Cape Town. They don't call us Cape of Storms for nothing. So sorry about the noise.
On a personal note, hey, one UCT to another. Hi.
Oh yes, okay, fantastic. Great, Sandy.
So when Beverly and Lindsay Oates and Chris and Nadia Crittenton and myself wrote the paper back in 2000, we actually were challenged even back then about how useful the metaphor was. So even then it was challenging. And I think you're absolutely right. Our view of what science is a bit different to when Kelly was theorizing. And I also have I actually prefer the word anticipation rather than prediction. For me, prediction means that, like those of you that aren't frightened of statistics, when you're looking at a regression model, for example, about this predicting X predicting Y, it's not always like that. And in fact, the anticipation for me is a series of things that could happen rather than one thing happening. So I think you're right, and I think the other thing I think that's really interesting is that Kelly actually, his first job was, I think, teaching drama, and I think for me, I've often wanted to play around with the idea of person as actor. And that encompasses more of his theory, because there's actually something really interesting about, and it's part of his theory, isn't it? I mean, the idea of actually thinking about other possibilities and the power of actually taking on a role. I know it's acting, but you can take on this role. So I have thought about the idea of maybe we should change the metaphor from person as scientist to person as actor, because it does open up more of what I think is about anticipation. You can explore things a little more rather than a linear or one-to-one, predicting. So yeah, so they're just some of my thoughts around that. And if I start to fall asleep, please, not off, please excuse me. If I'm not being coherent, please excuse me.
Shay, you wanted to say something.
You hear me okay?
Yes.
There was something came up in our discussion in the breakout room, which was the great proliferation of conspiracy theories, particularly during COVID. And it seems that, just listening to the conversation before, that ties in some ways with the idea of non-validation. Somebody disengaging from the mainstream conversation, looking for certainty within a tribal or an easily definable narrative. And I'm wondering if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it actually ties in with Roger's question as well. If it looks like people are seeking certainty and predictability in a way that, to me, makes sense with the original interpretation of the scientist rather than the actor. So I was going to throw that back. Does the apparent proliferation of conspiracy theories, which maybe were always there in the first place, but we see more of them now, does that tie into the idea of disengagement from the mainstream, from what's seen as a mainstream conversation, because you want certainty rather than the fear of being shown to be invalid to yourself?
Peter Edward, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, because it's really responding to Shay, because we had a bit of a conversation, Roger and I, about Trump and the fact that what he offers is very hard to give any credence to, and therefore, in terms of what Shay's talking about, the question in my mind is, why do people support Trump when he so blatantly is not a reliable person to put your faith into? And running through all of this talk, running in the back of my mind is issues around defenses against anxiety, and that if the alternative is to be pushed to confront the failure of your ability to anticipate what's coming, then another option is to say, you know what, I will actually retreat to allowing someone else to put themselves in the place of being the guarantor of the predictability, let's say, or the control, because that's more comfortable for me. It's not comfortable necessarily, but it's more comfortable than having to confront the loss of my own ability to anticipate and predict. And I think conspiracy theories as well, Shay, may fit into a little bit of that. People don't want them debunked because they give them a sense of comfort and surety, which is actually avoiding them having to confront the anxiety that they would otherwise have to confront in a world which is so hard to predict at the moment. So just like sort of nuanced, I think, on what Shay was getting at there.
Can I comment?
Yeah.
Building on what I think it's Roger and some other people said, who I can't remember anymore. Sorry, I wish I could name you. I think that Roger talked about the scientist metaphor and how it might need to change. I think that the greatest strength of Kelly's theory is also the greatest weakness of the theory. And the greatest strength of the theory, it seems to me, is the capacity to represent individual ways of thinking. And much of our discussion is focused on the individual's anxiety, the individual's slot rattling, the individual's what's going on within the individual. One of the biggest changes in science, at least I could think of, at least in social science, is the movement toward understanding science is not an individual activity, but a relational activity. It's a conversation. And when I think about COVID and slot rattling and changing constructs and anxiety, it seems to me that it's in the relation, it's in our dialogues that we're going to be able to really transform who we are in the face of non-validation, that we need each other. We need each other in order to build bold new ways of thinking and being, because we can't do it ourselves, because the problem is so much bigger than we are. I think that the conspiracy theories and the Trump, what Peter was suggesting before, why do people support Trump? Why do people create conspiracy theories? Because we seem to have fallen into our individual selves and have lost the sense of, a sense of common ground, the agonistic center that allows us to interact and really to build new ways of thinking.
Perhaps what we're really asking for is a shift from man as a scientist, or person as a scientist, to person as an actor, because the actor implies at least an audience that can interact with them.
And acting also has the benefit of an improvisational, because actors improvise, and so
conspiracy theories could then be thought of as narrative, I suppose, which is then script, and that can be changed.
Can I butt in?
I'm really going to be boring and just say that we have about a minute left, because I've just added on some time. So I'm sorry. Could you, Rhea, please make your point? But I think it's going to be
very quickly. I was going to mention. I think it was Louis Botella, who I don't know if he's here today, who came up quite a long time ago about replacing the intuitive scientist with the narrative, so the narrative metaphor. But picking up on the relational issues that Michael was just telling us, I was going to say is that something like conspiracy theory, for instance, and others, provides a certainty of a narrative, and it's a shared narrative. It's something that if we believe in the theory, if we subscribe to it, we kind of share, and it gives us the support of there are other people believe the same as us. So, so there is a certainty because, not because it's going into the individual, but because it is relational and it's shared, a shared belief, in a conviction in something. So that was very, very quickly the point I wanted to make.
I can see the potential for so many papers coming out of this discussion. People's faces are all lighting up as I'm watching you. please put some of your thoughts on our website, or at least talk to each other, because this sounds like there's some really interesting thinking going on. I can just watching people's eyes light up. It's wonderful. And I'm going to have to pull this to a close, I'm afraid. We have run out of time. Harry, I'm going to hand back over to you to close. Thank you to everybody who's added to the discussion and put all of these ideas out there. It's lovely. Harry, back over to you. You're muted.
I mean, haven't we got we go through to past, don't we? So we have got 10 minutes left. Maybe if I do some of the things I was going to do in the 5 minutes, then we could go back to a little bit more talking. I mean, I just want to thank Peter very much for an incredibly clear and interesting presentation. Absolutely brilliant. Yes, let's all clap. We were going to give a little bit of time for anyone who wants to discuss the meetup series itself. So if there's any discussion about that, while you're thinking about whether you want to do that, I just wanted to mention a couple of house points, if you like. The next presentation will be Robert Wright. He was there a minute ago. Are you there, Robert? You still there?
Yes, Harry, I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Yeah.
Yeah.
Robert has got long experience in the management of an organizational field. And next time, that's 2 weeks' time, he'll be talking about a very creative new method that he's been working on called the focused system. So I just want to recommend that you all come back for that. We've also introduced an extra session. They're fortnightly sessions. They're 13 fortnightly sessions. We've put in an extra one on the 5th of November, which is Pam De Nicolo and her colleagues, Marie-Louise Österlind from Sweden, Pam's at Reading University, and a couple of other of her, let's find their names. Yes, Shane Dowell and Kim Bradley Cole, and she's going to be focusing on reflecting on her research experience over many years, and the other three did PhDs with her, if I understand. And you can see it on the program. She's got an interesting talk. So there will actually be 3 in a row at weekly intervals. Just wanted to warn you of that. Managing the whole time aspect of this thing has been quite a sharp learning curve. I know some people were disappointed, and I've had several emails saying, oh, we can't attend at this new time. But we did want to help the Australians not to have to go deep into the small hours of the night. What time is it with you now, Peter?
Sorry, it's getting close to 12:30.
Yeah, well, I think you're very heroic. You're actually looking incredibly fresh.
Oh, it's the caffeine. Lots of caffeine.
I wonder who's got the earliest time, though. Who got some?
Well, it's California, and Bob Niemeyer said, I'm not getting up at 5 in the morning.
Exactly, yeah.
Wonderful series.
We can have a vote for which would be worse, 12:30 or 5 in the morning.
Yeah.
I'd go for the 12:30 with you, Peter.
I mean, if you live in the middle of the Pacific, you're ruled out altogether. That's a little bit more than non-validation there, I think. So I apologize to those people in Hawaii and Fiji and places. But it's quite neat that we've been able to get the scope that we have, I think.
Harry, you can also get them to do pre-recording so they can still take part, and then we can open up the discussion.
Can you say more how that would work?
So they can do a pre-recording for, say, 20 minutes, and we can listen to that pre-recording in our live session. Yeah. And then we open up for discussions. They don't get left out.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, this is the first series, and as we've wanted to emphasize all along, we want this to complement the conferences that we hopefully continue to have. So there will be a Padua conference in Italy in July 2021, hopefully, given the COVID situation. I mean, they're talking about a vaccine coming out at the end of this year, and that would transform things, but I suspect it would take several months to implement in a significant way. But we will, as far as I'm feeling anyway, that we should do all this again, have a second term, if you like, of meetup groups starting at a similar time next year, so maybe September next year. And while I'm on that, if anyone would like to present, we'd be very pleased to get kind of people who would like to present sessions on that series. Are there any other sort of issues about the actual process itself? The way we've been doing things? Any improvements or suggestions? That would be great. Anyone want to comment at all?
What it is to have reached perfection already, Harry.
Oh, well, you're very kind. It doesn't feel so secure to me, I can tell you. Especially with the computer doing weird things this morning. I thought, well, I don't really want to have to disappoint 50 people at a time.
Yeah,
Tell you what, though, if you... Someone else?
I've got a quick question.
Hi, Jenny.
Hi, Harry. This meetup series is new, and you've just been discussing aspects of that. So are we experimenting or are we acting when we take part in this?
Oh, both.
I was just interested in the experimenter versus the scientist versus actor.
Can you say more?
Well, yeah, I was just thinking that surely this, well, for me, this series of meetups seems to be an experiment in a new way of working. I'm not sure how I could align that with acting. I know we can come here in this space and take on a role, but the endeavor in itself seems to me to be a more scientific one. I don't know what anyone else thinks about that.
Very interesting. Any comments?
That was all.
Peter, you were the one that brought up the constructive acting.
So I'm reminded of an interaction between Laurence Olivier and Dustin Hoffman. So when there's a movie called The Marathon Man, where Sir Lawrence plays this horrible, evil person who's torturing Dustin Hoffman, and Dustin Hoffman, you know, didn't sleep for days and didn't eat and lost weight, and so that he could get into the character, and he was a method actor, and Sir Lawrence turned around and said, Dustin, have you considered acting as a way of... So I think one of the other things about the theory is this ability, and I think Spencer McWilliams, I think, talked about the invitational mood of the theory, inviting us to participate in something. And I mean, look, I'm off the top of my head, it might be a bit of both, I think, as Harry has alluded to, that there is a sense in which we're taking on a new role, and playing around with that role, experimenting with that role, the idea of you know, the idea of improvising as well. I think that there's, you know, And some of my, colleagues would say that, the chemists in our university do really well because they mix a couple of chemicals and all of a sudden there's a paper there. So, they're just playing around with things. And there is, a lot of the things that we do in science involves the imagination, involves ability to imagine and to explore things that we haven't. It's not always this, do this and test this. There comes a point where you go, oh, I've got no idea, but let's try and explore. So I think, something to do over the summer here, I think, for me to try and explore that a little bit more.
I think there's a danger of getting into either or. And Miller's notion of community of selves, as me as actor, me as scientist, makes much more sense to me than to say, let's abandon one metaphor and pick another.
Yeah,